Sure. Thank you, Katrina. Really appreciate that. All right. I'm going to throw this one question out to all three of you. And this has to do with the likelihood that um, tariffs could be put on countries that are locations where Chinese investment is creating assembly plants or manufacturing plants to service the broader economic demand. So if the Trump administration studies the circumvention of tariffs by China by a third party countries, how likely is it that some of these third parties that are located in Asia um, would see additional tariffs imposed on them? And particularly, would they be very strategic? Like, could we see tariffs being put on just specific industries in which Chinese companies participate in some of these third parties in the region? And who can I ask to take that?
I'm happy to
Maybe.
speak
Okay,
quickly to it.
Harry, good.
It's yeah, it's a really great question because there's lots of different ways that Chinese goods can make their way into the US. If you think about how trade can be rerouted, it can, the simplest is goods from China stop off at a port in Vietnam, change ships, go off to the US. That's the simplest form. That kind of hides the country of origin of the goods and ultimately gets there. You've got the kind of more slightly sophisticated form of rerouting where assembly lines are shifted fully. So most of the production still happens within China, but it's all put together in a third country and then shipped off. And then you've got the sort of the most complex way of rerouting trade, which is fully shifting production into third countries. So Chinese outward foreign investment that Stefan was talking to before, and production coming there, but profits often still being sent back to China. The US is clearly going to be trying to counter this. This was sort of somewhat of a loophole that they left open last time. And I think we'll see that be a far more targeted route. I mean, the kind of lesson from last time was if you want to remove or reduce reliance on China, you have to take a broader approach. You can't simply introduce bilateral tariffs because trade can continue to shift around. How they do it? Well, the fact that we didn't get any clear announcements yesterday on tariffs, either on China or more broadly outside of Canada and Mexico, suggests that they might take their time on this and do it in a more methodical approach than perhaps what we'd expected from some of the comments on the campaign trail. And that I think does leave open things like specific goods or specific industries facing tariffs as opposed to that blanket 5, 10, 20% that's been floated.
All right. I see a poll that has come up. I think that's our signal that we need to start bringing Q&A to a close. Let me just, ask all of our participants, please, to fill in this poll that appears on your screen right now. And while you're doing that, we'll continue with just a few more questions. Again, this one for you, Harry, is what are the possible ways that China can retaliate in terms of reverse tariffs? We know that China imports a whole lot less from the US than they export to the US. And a lot of that is in basic commodities, agriculture, and such. So, what can China do in terms of retaliation?
It is very, very tricky. As you say, the kind of bargaining power in this is quite clearly with the US. They are the one that is trying to reduce considerably the amount of exports going to their country from China, whereas China imports a lot less coming from the US. If we look back at history as to give us an insight into what might happen this time around, well, again, they pretty much went 1-for-1 with tariffs coming from the US last time, and I suspect it will be quite similar this time. I think also, though, the way that Trump is imposing or announcing tariffs, they're very much linked to key issues. And so, fentanyl was the reason for the 10% increase that's already been announced, but not yet implemented. It'll probably be, or future tariffs will be linked to other issues. And that kind of allows for a bit more negotiation to happen, as opposed to last time where it was such blanket, large tariffs that sort of were linked to quite abstract arguments that made it quite hard to negotiate and actually kind of retaliate to as well. So I think this time negotiations will make it a touch easier to not only prevent tariffs rising as high, but also bringing them back down. And just quickly, that was one of the questions that we had through the Q&A earlier was, why do we expect them tariffs to peak and then come back down so quickly through 2026 and 2027? Well, that is predominantly linked to the fact that these tariffs are likely to be linked to issues that can be negotiated as opposed to last time when they were a touch more abstract.
And I think to add to your point as well, Harry, I think it's important to keep in mind the context with which China's coming into this Trump presidency this time around. I mean, first time around, China's economy was in a healthier position. This time around, I'd say that they're really limping into this year. And we saw that experts, as you mentioned, were such a critical support to their growth last year. If exports aren't going to be as supportive, then they do need to focus on issues at home, but they're going to still be doing what they can to make sure that that export environment doesn't become unnecessarily challenging as well. So sure, they'll be strategic with what they retaliate with, but at the same time, they're still going to keep in mind, because it's very clear that no one actually wins out of this tit-for-tat trade battle. And so they'll continue to perhaps retaliate, but in ways that won't escalate to a point of no return, I think. And so I think that is a source of comfort for a lot of us.
Yeah, I think one of these points that both of you are making, that tariffs are, to a certain extent, almost a basis for negotiation rather than an endpoint in the way Trump is pursuing this policy right now. From that point of view, I think all eyes right now are going to be on Canada and Mexico to see how they negotiate with the Trump administration and where any tariffs actually end up lying on those two economies. That'll give us a good sense of how much negotiation will be taking place on all of these tariffs, and what's Trump really looking for in terms of the purpose of these tariffs. I had one final question. I thought I'd take this one myself, and it basically was, what does this all mean for the price of oil? If we're looking at a weaker economy globally, are we looking at weaker demand for energy and then lower oil prices? And indeed, in our baseline forecast, we have pulled the forecast down for Brent crude a little bit. Today, as referenced, we're at about $79 a barrel for Brent crude. By the end of this year, our forecast is that it'll fall to about $73 and down to a low of something just under $70 in somewhere early to mid 2027. And then when we get through all this volatility and uncertainty and the global economy perhaps begins to accelerate and demand accelerates, we get back into a long-term trend of $70 to $75 a barrel oil through the end of the decade. But we do have weaker oil prices now going into 2026 into early 2027. Now, one risk to this outlook, of course, is that supply may be diminished more than we expect. There are new sanctions being placed on an increasingly large number of ships that transport oil out of Russia, particularly to China and India, and that could dampen supply, which would elevate prices a bit, and particularly would elevate energy prices for China and India because they might not have access to that supply from Russia. But bottom line, there is a bit of an impact on energy prices from this baseline scenario of increased tariffs around the world, and so we have factored that into our forecast as well.